They told me I was too young to lead, right after I'd just pulled their quarterly numbers out of a death spiral with nothing but spreadsheets, determination, and 3 sleepless nights fueled by gas station energy drinks. Richard Pemberton, the 60-something executive who smelled like mothballs, and regret leaned back in his leather chair, that probably cost more than my annual salary, and delivered the verdict with all the warmth of a morgue freezer, Emma, he said, like he was explaining basic math to a toddler. Leadership requires maturity, seasoning. You'll understand when you're older the promotion went to Kevin Ashford, a 42-year-old yes man, whose greatest achievement was perfecting the art of nodding enthusiastically while contributing absolutely nothing of value to any conversation ever held in that building. I sat there in that suffocating conference room watching him shake hands with Richard, like they'd just brokered world peace instead of handing a senior analyst position to someone whose idea of innovation was switching from Times New Roman to Calibri in his PowerPoint presentations. But here's the thing about being underestimated: it's like being handed a loaded weapon by someone who thinks it's a toy. They don't see the danger coming because they're too busy patting themselves on the back for being so wise, so experienced, so fucking seasoned. That night, I went home to my studio apartment, opened a bottle of wine that cost more than I should have spent, and stared at my laptop screen until the cursor started looking like a middle finger pointed directly at Richard's smug face. If you're watching this and nodding because you've been there, because you've had your ideas stolen, your contributions minimized, your potential capped by people who peaked during the Clinton administration, then smash that subscribe button like it owes you money, because this story is about to get very, very satisfying. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I did what any rational person does when they've been systematically undervalued. I started planning my revenge. Not the petty kind where you put fish in someone's air vents, though honestly that would have been therapeutic, but the kind that requires patience, capital, and a deep understanding of corporate vulnerability. I knew things about Pemberton Holdings that Richard had forgotten. He'd told me things during late-night strategy sessions when he was too tired to remember. I was just the kid who fetched his coffee. I knew about the shell company in Delaware. I knew about the vendor contracts that hadn't been reviewed since the Bush administration, the first one. And I knew about the aging client base that was hemorrhaging money faster than a punctured artery. The company was bleeding out slowly, quietly, and Richard was too busy playing golf with the board to notice the arterial spray on the walls. Over the next 6 months, I became a ghost in my own office, showing up doing my job with mechanical precision while secretly building something else entirely during lunch breaks. I made calls to former colleagues who'd jumped ship during weekends. I studied acquisition strategies and hostile takeover mechanics, like they were religious texts. And late at night, when the office was empty except for the security guard who'd started nodding at me like we were old friends, I photographed documents, copied files, and built a database that would make the NSA jealous. The beauty of being invisible is that no one watches you very carefully. They assume you're harmless, assume you're content with your little corner desk and your little responsibilities while you're quietly assembling the pieces of their destruction, like a puzzle made of corporate negligence and willful blindness. Kevin Ashford settled into his new role like a man getting comfortable in someone else's grave, completely unaware that the ground beneath him was already shifting. I watched him fumble through meetings, mispronounce client names, and somehow manage to lose 3 major accounts in his first month, while Richard praised his fresh perspective and strategic thinking. It was like watching someone compliment the Titanic's iceberg navigation skills, but Kevin Ashford wasn't my target. He was just collateral damage in a war he didn't even know was being fought. Richard had made this personal when he dismissed me with that patronizing smile, and now it was about to become very, very business. The first piece fell into place when I reconnected with David Chen, my former mentor who'd left Pemberton Holdings 2 years earlier to start his own private equity firm. David was brilliant, ruthless, and had exactly the kind of resources I needed for what I was planning. When I called him that Thursday evening, his voice carried the weight of someone who'd been waiting for this conversation. We met at a wine bar downtown, the kind of place where serious money discusses serious plans over glasses that cost more than most people's hourly wage. David listened while I laid out everything. the deteriorating client relationships, the bloated operational costs, the antiquated systems that were held together with duct tape and middle management incompetence. When I finished, he leaned back and smiled like a shark that had just spotted a wounded seal. "Emma," he said, "you're not planning a career move. You're planning a coup." I nodded. "That's exactly what I'm planning." David's firm had been looking for acquisition targets in our sector companies with solid fundamentals, but poor leadership organizations that could be streamlined, optimized, and turned profitable with the right team at the helm. Pemberton Holdings was perfect. A diamond buried under decades of corporate complacency and executive ego. The due diligence process took 3 months, during which I continued playing my role as the overlooked analyst while secretly feeding David's team insider information that wasn't technically insider trading, because I wasn't trading anything. I was just a concerned employee, providing market research to a potential investor who happened to be planning a complete organizational restructuring that would inevitably result in certain personnel changes starting at the top. Richard remained blissfully unaware, spending his days in meetings that accomplished nothing, while the company's value continued its steady decline. Kevin Ashford tried to implement new strategies that were really just old strategies with different PowerPoint templates, and I continued building my case file, like a prosecutor preparing for the trial of the century. Every document I collected, every email I forwarded, every financial discrepancy I highlighted was another nail in the coffin of their complacency. I documented Richard's decision to extend a failing vendor contract because the vendor's CEO was his golf buddy. I recorded conversations where Kevin Ashford confidently explained strategies he'd plagiarized from business magazines. I cataloged every instance of their combined incompetence until I had enough evidence to convince any reasonable investor that new management wasn't just advisable, it was essential for survival. The acquisition offer arrived on a Tuesday morning disguised as routine correspondence. David's firm, Titan Capital, proposed purchasing Pemberton Holdings for what appeared to be a generous premium over market value. Richard called an emergency board meeting, his voice tight with panic as he tried to rally support for rejecting the offer. But the board had been watching the quarterly reports. They'd seen the client exodus, the declining revenues, the operational inefficiencies that Richard had been explaining away for months. Titan's offer wasn't just generous, it was a lifeline for shareholders who'd been watching their investment slowly circle the drain during the board meeting, which I attended as the person responsible for presenting the financial analysis. I watched Richard's face cycle through the stages of corporate grief denial when he insisted the company wasn't for sale, anger when he realized the board was seriously considering the offer, bargaining when he tried to negotiate terms that would keep him in power, depression when he understood that his decades of leadership were being evaluated like a failed science experiment, and finally a hollow kind of acceptance when the vote was called and passed 7-2. The acquisition was approved. Richard's face went white, then red, then a strange shade of green, like he was processing the fact that his corporate kingdom was being sold out from under him by the very people he'd appointed to protect it. Kevin Ashford looked confused, which was his default expression, but with an added layer of existential dread, as he began to understand that new ownership typically meant new management, and new management typically meant that people like him became unemployed very quickly. I maintained my professional composure throughout the meeting, taking notes, like this was just another Tuesday. But inside, I was counting down the days until Richard would understand exactly how it felt to be dismissed by someone who thought they knew better. The transition period was announced as 60 days, during which Titan Capital would conduct a comprehensive operational review translation. They were going to dissect every department, every process, every decision made over the past 5 years, and determine who stayed, who went, and who got promoted to positions of actual authority. Richard tried to spin it as an opportunity for growth and innovation, telling the staff that new ownership would bring fresh capital and expanded opportunities. But his voice lacked conviction, and his hands shook slightly when he thought no one was looking. Kevin, Ashford attempted to position himself as indispensable, preparing presentation after presentation, highlighting his contributions and strategic vision. But since his contributions were minimal and his strategic vision was borrowed from outdated business books from the Clinton era, his efforts resembled a man trying to convince a firing squad that he was actually the commanding officer. I spent those 60 days in a strange state of suspended anticipation, continuing my regular duties, while knowing that everything was about to change dramatically. David kept me informed of the timeline. Titan would officially take control on a Monday morning. The new organizational structure would be announced that same day, and personnel changes would be implemented immediately. I knew exactly what those changes would entail because I'd helped design them during weekend strategy sessions at David's office where we mapped out the company's future. Like generals planning a campaign, we identified every inefficiency, every redundant position, every process that existed solely to justify someone's salary rather than contribute to profitability. I had become the architect of a complete organizational reconstruction, designed to eliminate the exact kind of leadership that had held me back while creating opportunities for people who actually deserved them based on merit rather than tenure, or the ability to play golf with the right executives. The night before the transition, I couldn't sleep. Not from nerves, but from anticipation. I'd spent months planning this moment, visualizing Richard's face when he realized that the young analyst he'd dismissed was about to become his superior. I made coffee at 3 in the morning and sat by my window watching the city sleep while I mentally rehearsed the conversation I'd been waiting to have for almost a year. I thought about every condescending comment, every dismissed suggestion, every time I'd been excluded from strategy meetings. Because I was too junior to contribute meaningful insights, despite having more knowledge about the company's operational realities than anyone in that conference room. I remembered the exact tone of voice Richard used when he explained that leadership requires seasoning, like he was discussing fine wine rather than business competence. And I smiled, knowing that in less than 6 hours, he was going to discover what actual leadership looked like when it wasn't filtered through decades of entitlement and corporate politics. Monday morning arrived gray and cold, like the universe understood the gravity of what was about to unfold. I dressed carefully, choosing a navy blazer that conveyed authority without appearing theatrical. I wanted to look professional, competent, like someone who belonged in a leadership position, not like someone playing dress-up in borrowed clothes. The Titan Capital team arrived at 9 sharp, a convoy of black cars disgorging consultants, lawyers, and executives who moved through the building like a well-coordinated invasion force. They set up command in the main conference room, spreading laptops and documents across the table like they were establishing a field headquarters. Richard hovered nearby, trying to insert himself into conversations that clearly didn't include him. His usual confident demeanor replaced by the nervous energy of a man watching his empire crumble in real time. Kevin Ashford paced outside his office, looking like someone who'd just realized he'd been playing chess while everyone else was playing checkers, and the game was almost over. At 10:30, David called me into the conference room. I walked in trying to maintain my usual analytical composure while internally celebrating the fact that this moment had finally arrived. Richard and Kevin Ashford were already seated, looking like defendants waiting for a verdict that they suspected wouldn't go their way. David stood at the head of the table, a stack of documents in front of him, and began speaking in the measured tone of someone delivering news that would fundamentally alter several lives. "The operational review is complete," he said, "and we've identified several areas where organizational changes will improve efficiency and profitability." Richard shifted in his seat. "Kevin." Ashford stared at his hands like they might provide answers to questions he didn't know how to ask. David continued. "We're implementing a new management structure. Effective. Immediately, Richard Pemberton will be transitioning to an advisory role. Kevin Ashford's position is being eliminated, and the new director of strategic operations will be Emma Rodriguez. Silence, the kind of silence that occurs when the universe pauses to appreciate a moment of perfect poetic justice." Richard's mouth opened, then closed, like a fish processing the fact that the water had just turned to air. Kevin Ashford looked up confused, as if he'd missed something important and needed clarification. I stood up, walked to the head of the table, and extended my hand to David, who shook it with the formality of someone sealing a deal that had been months in the making. "Thank you for this opportunity," I said, my voice steady and professional. "I look forward to implementing the changes we've discussed." Richard finally found his voice. This is his voice, cracked slightly. "This is Emma. She's too young for this level of responsibility." David smiled, the kind of smile that suggested he'd been waiting for exactly this reaction. "Our analysis indicates that Emma has consistently demonstrated superior analytical skills, strategic thinking, and operational knowledge. She's also the only person in this organization who identified the systemic issues that were affecting profitability, which is why she's uniquely qualified to address them." Richard's face cycled through several emotions before settling on a mixture of disbelief and wounded pride. "But she's been here less than 3 years. She doesn't have the experience, the maturity." David's expression didn't change. "Experience isn't measured in years, Richard. It's measured in results, and Emma's results speak for themselves." Kevin Ashford finally spoke up. "What about my projects, my initiatives? They'll be evaluated under the new leadership structure," David replied, which was corporate speak for "everything you've touched will be scrapped and rebuilt by someone competent." I walked over to Richard's chair and looked down at him, not with malice, but with the calm satisfaction of someone who'd just proven a very important point. "Remember when you told me I'd understand leadership when I was older?" I said, my voice quiet but carrying clearly through the room. "Well, I'm still the same age, but now I understand something you never taught me. Leadership isn't about age or seasoning. It's about competence and the ability to see what needs to be done and do it regardless of who might be uncomfortable with the process." Richard stared at me like he was seeing me for the first time, which in a way he was. The invisible analyst had just transformed into his superior, and the cognitive dissonance was almost visible on his face. The room remained silent as I continued. "You spent so much time explaining why I wasn't ready that you never bothered to notice. I was already doing the job better than the people you promoted over me. I was solving problems you didn't even know existed while you were busy protecting the status quo. That was slowly killing this company." David handed me a folder containing my new employment contract. The salary was nearly triple what Richard had been paying me, and the title came with the authority to implement the changes I'd been recommending for months, changes that could have prevented this entire situation if someone had been willing to listen to ideas based on their merit rather than the age of the person presenting them. "Kevin." Ashford cleared his throat weakly. "Emma, I think there might be some misunderstanding about my role here, about the value I bring to." I cut him off gently, but firmly. "Kevin Ashford, your role was eliminated because it didn't create value. It existed to process information that other people generated and presented in meetings where other people made decisions. Your position was administrative, not strategic, and we're streamlining operations to focus on actual productivity rather than bureaucratic theater." His face flushed, but he didn't argue, probably because somewhere in his mind he understood that everything I'd just said was accurate, and that his inability to contribute meaningfully to strategic discussions had finally caught up with him in a way that couldn't be explained away or delegated to someone else. Richard made one last attempt to assert his relevance. "This is all very sudden," he said, his voice hollow. "I think the board should have more time to consider the implications of such dramatic organizational changes." David responded with the patience of someone explaining basic mathematics. "The board approved these changes, Richard. They're based on 18 months of performance data and financial analysis. The company has been underperforming consistently, and our review identified leadership as the primary bottleneck to profitability. These aren't dramatic changes. They're necessary corrections." Richard's shoulders sagged as the reality of his situation fully registered. He was no longer the decision maker. He was no longer the authority figure. He was no longer even relevant to the strategic direction of the company he'd run for over a decade. He was a consultant, now a role that sounds important but carries about as much actual power as a middle school hall monitor. I spent the remainder of that first week systematically dismantling every inefficient process, every redundant system, every comfortable arrangement that had been masquerading as business strategy for years. I eliminated Kevin Ashford's position, along with 3 other middle management roles that existed primarily to justify their own existence, rather than contribute to operational efficiency. I renegotiated vendor contracts, saving the company nearly 40% on operational costs by removing the Golf Buddy premium that Richard had been paying for substandard services. I implemented new client retention strategies that stopped the hemorrhaging of accounts that had been ongoing for months, while Richard convinced himself it was just market conditions rather than managerial incompetence. And I restructured the entire operational workflow to eliminate the bottlenecks that occurred when decisions had to filter through multiple layers of management who added delay without adding value. Richard remained as an advisor, which meant he had an office and a title, but no actual authority. A living reminder of what happens when you mistake tenure for competence. He attended meetings where I presented strategies and made decisions, watching from the sidelines as the company. He'd run into the ground, slowly returned to profitability under leadership. He'd deemed too young to matter. His presence in those meetings was almost surreal, like watching a deposed king observe his replacement actually governing effectively while he struggled to understand where his reign had gone wrong. The first quarterly report under my management showed a 12% increase in revenue and a 28% reduction in operational costs numbers that spoke louder than any argument about experience or maturity. The board meeting where these numbers were presented was perhaps the most satisfying hour of my professional life as I watched Richard's face while I explained how basic competence and strategic thinking had transformed his failing company into a profitable operation. In less than 90 days, David introduced me to the board as the architect of Pemberton Holdings' turnaround, a title that carried significantly more weight than senior analyst, and came with a salary that reflected my actual value to the organization rather than my age, or the arbitrary timeline Richard had established for career advancement. The board members who had once smiled politely while dismissing my suggestions now hung on every word of my quarterly presentations, asking detailed questions about my strategic vision and requesting additional analysis on market opportunities I'd identified months earlier but hadn't been allowed to pursue under the previous management structure. It was like watching people suddenly discover they could see color after years of viewing the world in black and white. 6 months later, Kevin Ashford reached out via LinkedIn asking if there were any opportunities at Pemberton Holdings under the new management structure. I replied professionally that we'd implemented a more stringent hiring process that emphasized proven results over theoretical experience, but wished him well in his future endeavors. The irony wasn't lost on me that he was now seeking employment from someone he'd once viewed as too junior to deserve consideration for promotion. It was a small moment, but it crystallized everything about how dramatically the power dynamics had shifted. Richard lasted 8 months as an advisor before taking early retirement. His farewell email cited a desire to spend more time with family and pursue other interests, which everyone understood to mean he couldn't handle working for someone half his age who'd proven that everything he thought he knew about leadership was fundamentally wrong. His departure was quiet, dignified, but unmistakably defeat. He'd been outmaneuvered not by someone with more experience or better connections, but by someone who simply understood the business better than he did and wasn't afraid to act on that understanding. I kept his resignation email in a folder on my desktop, not out of spite, but as a reminder that competence doesn't have an expiration date, and that the most dangerous thing you can do in business is underestimate someone based on arbitrary criteria, like age or experience level, when you could be evaluating them based on results. innovation, and the ability to identify and solve problems that others prefer to ignore. The company continued growing under my leadership, expanding into new markets, developing innovative service offerings, and building the kind of client relationships that Richard had been losing through neglect and complacency. I hired young, talented analysts who understood that ideas mattered more than hierarchy and gave them the opportunities I'd been denied, creating an organizational culture where competence was rewarded regardless of how long someone had been warming a particular chair or how many golf games they'd played with existing management. The transformation wasn't just financial, it was cultural. We went from an organization that valued tenure over talent to one that prioritized innovation and results. Meetings became productive strategy sessions rather than exercises in ego management. Decisions were made based on data and analysis rather than gut feelings and personal relationships. And people were promoted based on their ability to contribute to the company's success rather than their ability to avoid making waves or challenging existing assumptions. 2 years after the acquisition, Pemberton Holdings was acquired again, this time by a larger firm that recognized the value of what we'd built. David's investment had paid off spectacularly, returning nearly 4 times the initial capital in less than 24 months. And my role evolved again, this time to Vice President of Strategic Development, overseeing multiple companies within the portfolio. Each transition reminded me that the best revenge isn't just success, it's building something so undeniably excellent that the people who doubted you are forced to acknowledge their mistake, publicly, professionally, and permanently. Richard's dismissal of my potential had been based on assumptions about what leadership looked like rather than what leadership actually accomplished. He'd confused age with wisdom, experience with competence, and familiarity with effectiveness. The result was a company that stagnated under his guidance and flourished under mine, proving that the qualities that matter in business have nothing to do with how long you've been alive, and everything to do with how clearly you can think and how effectively you can execute. If you've made it this far, you're part of the small percentage of people who understand that age is just a number, but competence is everything, so hit that subscribe button. Like you're voting out every Richard Pemberton who ever told you to wait your turn. While they fumbled opportunities, you could have executed flawlessly, because sometimes the best way to prove you're ready to lead is to systematically dismantle every excuse people have for not letting you, and then rebuild everything better than they ever imagined possible.